We've been looking at the Christmas story through the Gospel of Matthew. And we're going to continue in these opening chapters of Matthew all the way until Ash Wednesday. Just if you want to do for your own personal Bible reading, the first 5 chapters of Matthew are going to be our focus all through this winter till spring. And we need to remember when we're reading any of the Gospels, but particularly now I'm talking about Matthew, while they're talking about real events and real people, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are telling a story. And Matthew is very good at using sort of storytelling techniques that help his reader, especially a first century Jewish reader, to connect to the story. So we got to remember that they're telling about true events, but they're telling this story. They want us to listen and remember what they're saying. And one of those methods that Matthew uses especially is he doesn't always tell things in order. And sometimes we know he doesn't tell them in order. It's real easy. Like in our lesson today, the way that Matthew tells the story is like this. Joseph and family flee to Egypt. Joseph and family live in Egypt. Herod searches for the baby. Joseph and family move to Nazareth. That's the order that Matthew tells it in. But we know that that's not the right order because, he makes it clear in the story. He just adds this thing. They moved to Egypt. They stayed there till Herod was dead. And after the Magi left and Herod was so mad, then he's looking for the baby. So he goes, it's sort of like that. If you watched black and white westerns as a kid, meanwhile back at the ranch, while all this activity's going on in town, while they're living in Egypt, where they're going to Egypt, this is what happened back in Bethlehem and in Jerusalem and in Israel. But the way the story actually happened, we have to move that down because they were still traveling to Egypt by the time Herod figured out what was going on and did all the terrible things that he did. And so this is the chronological order of the story, and this is the order I'm going to talk about it in. But just to know that I'm not changing the story. I'm just putting it in chronological order because Matthew is telling a story that he wants the people to relate to. And very specifically, I'm saying Joseph and family because that's how Matthew is telling the story. And this has nothing to do with patriarchy or male dominance. It's nothing like that. It has everything to do with, for Matthew, this whole thing, everything about Jesus coming, his birth, his life, his death, his resurrection, it's all tied to the Old Testament. For Matthew, the Old Testament leads inevitably to Jesus. And so he is specifically tying this story to the Old Testament by highlighting that Joseph was Mary's husband who gave birth to Jesus. And Joseph is the descendant of Abraham. And Joseph is the descendant of David. And Joseph is the one the angel speaks to highlight this connection to the Old Testament, this continuation of the story of the Old Testament in the person of Jesus. So, like I said, Matthew wants us to see that the Old Testament inevitably and naturally leads to Jesus. But even more than that, when I have the story broken in these 4 parts, we say that each of these parts ties directly to an Old Testament person, place, thing, or event. Matthew, everything, and what Matthew is doing by the end of this, what we're going to see, is that Matthew says, look at the Old Testament, read the story of Israel, look at the New Testament, read the story of Jesus, and you're going to see the one mirrors the other. The one foreshadows the other. Only the outcomes are very different. So where we are, Jesus has been born. The wise men the Magi have come to Bethlehem and have bowed down before him, have worshipped him. And then, being warned by an angel not to go tell Herod where the baby was, they've gone back home by a different route. So after the Magi were gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up, flee to Egypt with the child and his mother," the angel said. "Stay there until I tell you to return, because Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." That night, Joseph left for Egypt with the child and Mary, his mother. You see how it's Joseph is the one the story's being told through. But I've put in italics Egypt and child, because I want to talk about those for just a second. One, mostly in the Bible, Egypt is remembered as the place where the Israelites spent 400 years in slavery. That's mostly how it's remembered, but not only, because Egypt is also the place where many people went to seek refuge, to find sanctuary. We had Abraham, when there was a famine, went to Egypt. Jacob and his family ended up in Egypt because of the famine. That's the whole thing with David and the coat of many colors and all of that. Jeroboam, who spoke out against Solomon when Solomon was king. Solomon, at the end of his reign, was a terrible king. He basically enslaved the people, and Jeroboam spoke out against him and ended up having to flee, and he went to Egypt for political sanctuary. The prophet Jeremiah, who plays prominently in today's lesson, he went to Egypt as a refugee, a war refugee. It was against his will. He basically was a prisoner, but there were people leaving Egypt leaving Jerusalem to go to Egypt because of a war, and they made Jeremiah come with them. So Matthew is tying Jesus to these Old Testament people who often sought shelter and sanctuary in Egypt, and seeing how where Abraham, where that's the Gospel of Matthew starts with Abraham and leading down to Joseph as the descendant of Abraham. Now Joseph and Mary and Jesus are going to follow in the footsteps of Abraham and find sanctuary in Egypt. Now, as far as this child, in English we have a lot of different words for child. You can say child, say kid, say youth, rugrat, whatever is needed at that moment to refer to get across, what we're talking about with that child. Same in ancient Greek, they had different words for child. 4 of the most common are these words. Teknon is a very common word. The emphasis there is on parentage. It would be my child, her child, your child. It's a possessive word tied to that. This is when Jesus stays in the temple when he's 12 years old and his family goes home, and then they come back and they find him, and that's what Mary says. She says, "My teknon, my child, how could you do this to me?" Laying on that guilt on Jesus. You are my child, yet you did this to me. Another one is nepios. The emphasis here is on being simple-minded or lacking understanding. It is the word used for infants. When you see infant in the New Testament, quite often that's where it comes from. But Jesus also used it for having childlike faith. People who believe and then seek to understand what they believe, rather than seeking to understand and then say, I'll believe. He's praised to God. He says, God, I thank you, Father, that you did not reveal this to the wise and powerful of the world, but the nepios, the infants of the world. And he says, you must have an nepios faith, a childlike faith, to follow him. And then there is pais. This is just the generic word child. And then what would be grammatically the diminutive form of that is paidion, and that has to do, the emphasis there is on immature behavior, a toddler, the terrible twos, or sometimes it hits kids in their threes, the terrible threes. That's what that word is. So Matthew has a whole host of words to use here, because the angel spoke Hebrew to Joseph, and to put it into Greek, Matthew has all these different words to choose from. The word he chooses is the paidion. This is a clue on the timeline of events. He doesn't say the infant, he doesn't say the child, he says the young child, the toddler. Joseph, take the toddler and his mother Mary and flee to Egypt. So I know what our banner has over here. They're all in the stable together, and probably in the mind of the artist here, the soldiers from Herod are coming down the street right now to get the baby. We've compressed the time to celebrate this in the small window we have of celebrating Christmas. But really, there's a month, maybe up to 2 years have passed since the birth of Jesus. So Joseph takes his family, and they follow in the footsteps of his ancestor Abraham, and they seek safety and security in Egypt. Now Herod was furious when he realized that the Magi had played him for the fool. He sent soldiers to kill all the boys in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, based on the Magi's report of the star's first appearing. Herod's brutal action fulfilled what God had spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A cry was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning. Rachel weeps for her children, refusing to be comforted, for they are no more. First thing is, an illegitimate ruler, which is what Herod is always threatened by even the idea of a legitimate ruler. That's why when a dictator takes over a government, the first thing they do is ban people being able to assemble together. It's also why when our founders of when our nation's founders, one of the first things they did was say, the government can't stop people. You have the right to assemble. So Herod is terrified by even the idea that somebody else could be the legitimate ruler. He is not a legitimate ruler. He rules through terror and brute force because a foreign power backs him up. But what happens here is Matthew quotes Jeremiah. It's Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15. Matthew, he's tying the birth of Jesus to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. That's the context of Jeremiah 31. Jeremiah is in Jerusalem, and the armies of the empire of Babylon are coming. And Jeremiah says, the armies of Babylon are coming, and they're going to destroy Jerusalem. They're going to destroy the temple. They're going to haul us away as captives. That's why all these people fled, and they made Jeremiah come with them. But Jeremiah said, this passage, he said, a cry is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning. Rachel weeps. Well, Rachel has been dead for centuries by this point. Rachel was one of Jacob's wives, Jacob's favorite wife, the mother of Joseph and Benjamin. But tradition holds that Rachel's tomb was buried in this area of Ramah. Ramah is a city just north of Jerusalem. And it is the most likely place after the armies of Babylon came and destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and herded all the people together to be taken away in captivity. That's where it was done, in Ramah, near Rachel's tomb. And so Jeremiah says, when all this happens, when the armies of Babylon come and destroy Jerusalem, and when they destroy the temple, and they're going to line us all up there at Ramah and haul us away by Rachel's tomb, and nothing will be able to quench the tears of Rachel, he's speaking figuratively here, because her children are no more. Israel will be no more. Jerusalem will be no more. The temple will be no more. So Matthew is tying Jesus' birth and life to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. This is more than just foreshadowing, because for about 40 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, Jerusalem and the temple will be destroyed by the Roman armies. What's really going on here, though, is Matthew is speaking figuratively. He's speaking theologically and opening the door for us to understand that Jesus is going to replace the temple. This is also, he shows us later in Holy Week, we see more of this, but he's opening up the door to this idea that Jerusalem and the temple, who have played this role as the city of God and the place where God lives on earth, are going to be no more. They stayed there until Herod's death. This fulfilled what the Lord had spoken through the prophet, I called my son out of Egypt. So this whole passage here, this cry of Ramah, Rachel's tears happening because of the death of these children, which immediately then is followed by the death of Herod in the storytelling. Just a quick note, we're not talking hundreds or thousands of babies here. Bethlehem is a small village, but think of it this way. If it were a dozen babies, if a dozen babies die in a city of millions and millions of people, it might be a blip on the news. But think if you got a town like a Lockridge or a Batavia or a Libertyville and a dozen babies died. It would be devastating. It would shape that town for a generation and longer. So when I say it wasn't hundreds or thousands of babies, I'm not diminishing the impact. I'm actually highlighting the impact. You look at, in a small town, to lose a dozen babies would be devastating. And so we hear this, the cry of Rachel, the cry from Ramah. And he quotes Hosea here. When he says then he goes on right immediately with the death of Herod, and they stayed there till Herod died. Then he says, I called my son out of Egypt. Well, we just heard Jennifer read that. Only I don't expect you were listening to it thinking, oh, Matthew's going to reference this and Pastor Chris is going to talk about it. Because he says, this fulfilled that I call my son out of Egypt. Let's look again at what it says. When Israel was a child, I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. So far, so good. But the more I called to him, the farther he moved from me, offering sacrifices to the image of Baal and burning incense to idols. Obviously, Matthew is not saying that about Jesus. He's not saying that Jesus worshiped idols. When Matthew quotes the Old Testament, it's like a footnote. He's saying for more information on this, look here. So when he quotes Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, he wants us to read the whole chapter, the whole part of Hosea 11, because it says something about him using this passage, saying, I called my son out of Egypt. So basically, here's the outline. God says, I called my son out of Egypt. The more I called him, the further he ran away from me. So my child runs away from me, I will destroy him. But wait, I'm God. I'm not a mere mortal. And this is tearing my heart in two. So I will not destroy them. And one day they will return to me. It says at the very end, it says, one day I'll roar like a lion and they will return to me. And Matthew is saying, when he quotes, I call my son out of Egypt, he's saying, go read Hosea 11. In the end of that, God says, one day they'll all come back to me. Matthew is saying, this is that day. That the birth of Jesus is that day that God is going to call the people back to him. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. Get up, the angel said. Take the child and his mother back to the land of Israel, because those who were trying to kill the child are dead. So Joseph got up and he returned to the land of Israel with Jesus and his mother. But when he learned that the new ruler of Judea was Herod's son Archelaus, he was afraid to go there. Then, after being warned in a dream, he left the region for the region of Galilee. So the family went and lived in the town called Nazareth. This fulfilled what the prophet had said, he will be called a Nazarene. Herod's death. Well, all we know for sure is Herod died, which is kind of strange. Herod, he ruled in the Roman government, which kept pretty good records of stuff. We have a lot of those records, but the records are sometimes, well, they're vague. They make references we don't understand. Sometimes we have conflicting information, and it's possible his family outright lied about it in the official records. Not that they kept it a secret when he died. That was no secret. Actually, there was quite a celebration in Jerusalem when Herod died. The people hated him. But in the official records, it's possible his family fudged some dates so they could point to these official records and tell the Roman government, see, we're the legitimate power now. We're the legitimate authority. Somewhere between 5 BC and 1 AD, Herod died. The date that scholars most often point to is 4 BC. Well, you know what that means? We just had New Year's. It's 2016. So we get to celebrate the end of the decade all over again in 4 years. But that's not a really huge point. The point is, Herod died. He was an illegitimate power, trying to stop the legitimate power. That's where the story ends, with Herod dying. The story, of course, then goes Jesus dying and not staying dead. But Matthew ends this whole section here. He ends with this passage. This fulfilled what the prophets had said. He will be called a Nazarene. We have a problem there. We don't have any record of any prophet ever saying the Messiah or anyone else will be a Nazarene. Now, it's possible some prophet said it and we've lost it. That is possible. I don't like that solution because I believe the Bible as we have it today, the Holy Spirit worked through the ages to bring it to us exactly as we have it because it's what we need now. And it wouldn't make sense for the Holy Spirit to make this very specific reference stay included all these centuries and not include what it means or where it's from. More likely, there's a cultural reference here we don't get. Because with the cultural reference, you get it or you don't. It's like when I was a kid growing up, and I'm sorry if this hits close to home for Cubs fans, I'm sorry. You did win a World Series a few years ago, so take solace in that. But all my life growing up, the GOAT, what's the GOAT? That's the one who screwed up and lost the game for you. Not anymore. They've changed it the last couple years. GOAT now is an acronym. You know what you know that? Greatest of all time. It means the opposite. But if you don't know that, you don't know that. So you don't know that they're talking in sports now when they say the GOAT, they mean this is the best ever. Not the person who lost the game and blew the championship. That's probably what we have going on here. There's a cultural reference we just don't know. But what it appears, an educated guess is that to be called a Nazarene is a derogatory reference of people from Nazareth, basically saying anyone from Nazareth is a backwater, hayseed, know-nothing hick. And we see that in the opening of the Gospel of John when the people who are going to become Jesus' disciples are talking to each other, and one of them says, I met this guy Jesus. I think he might be the one we've been waiting for. I think he might be the Messiah. And they're like, well, where is he from? Well, he's from Nazareth. He's like, are you kidding? Nothing good ever came from Nazareth. They're a bunch of nobody. They're a bunch of hayseeds. Now, if that's what Matthew means, which I think it is, we got a rich field to work with because the prophets and the Old Testament talk about that all the time. We see in some of the Psalms, in Isaiah a couple of times, there are others I could have put up here, that it talks about the one who's coming will be considered a nobody. The one who's coming will be considered of no account. The people will look at him and not realize who he is. That's where Matthew's going with this. That while Jesus threatened Herod, because he's a legitimate ruler and Herod was not, all through his life, people who are not legitimate in authority are going to attack Jesus, and one of their main ways of attacking him is saying, he's just this carpenter from Nazareth. He's a nobody. He's a Nazarene. And we know nothing good ever came out of Nazareth. So Matthew is telling us to look at the story of Israel in the Old Testament and see it as foreshadowing the life of Jesus. Only where the people of Israel kept getting it wrong, Jesus will get it right, and he will succeed. And that day promised in Hosea, when the people respond to the Lord and come back to the Lord, Matthew is saying, it's now. Let us pray. Lord God, we give you thanks so much for this masterful storytelling of Matthew, that he's taking these events in the life of Jesus and showing us how they tie to what came before. That how you created the nation of Israel and you brought it into being so you could bring Jesus into the world to reconcile us to you, to unite us to you. And we give you thanks for this in Jesus' name. Amen.